Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvard, outside of Cordova on Prince William Sound with Dune Lankard, a member of the Eagle clan of the Eyak tribal nation, a longtime commercial fisherman, also a founder of the Native Conservancy that serves 32 tribes throughout Alaska, an innovator in kelp farming, now looking into electric skiffs, man of many skills. So Dune, welcome, and like with all our shows, let me ask, what was your first connection with the ocean?
I grew up in a fishing family and got out on the water when I was like 5-6 years old. And once any of us was tall enough to reach the hydraulic handle for the power block, then we were recruited to go fishing. I remember first learning to be out at the sea when I was just a young man and seeing the whole operation and watching from the deck. And then as I got a little bit older and stronger, then it was my job to start helping pull the net in and eventually running the purse line. And using a purse winch was dangerous. And so my father was real particular about who actually got to purse the lines, because if it ever got hung up in the winch, it could actually pull you into it and break your arm, or same with the power block. And so there was some things that you had to be concerned about and alert with out on the sea. And one of the biggest things was just not to step off the side of the boat. Like when we went out on deck, we had to let someone know we were going out on deck. So in case we fell over for whatever reason, someone would know to at least that we were out there. And I remember one set that we made around a bunch of dogs.
That's dogfish, that's salmon.
Yeah, chum salmon. We had also got several salmon sharks in the net. And we would take the plungers and sink the corks so the salmon sharks could get out of the net.
And these are big sharks.
Yeah, they're like 8-9 feet long and big teeth. And I was just a young boy, and one of my jobs was to hoist the bow corks up and tie them off on the bow so we could keep the seine wide when we were pulling the purse line in. And I remember walking up there and seeing a shark come straight for me with the fin out of the water, and I got a little startled, and I literally fell down and sat on my bum with my feet dangling over the side of the boat, looking at this shark looking at me. And I was like, oh my God. And my father laughed. He said, oh, that shark won't hurt you. But I was happy to see it get out of the net, because we had 3 or 4 of them in the net, because they were chasing chum salmon that day too. But my first income from the sea was actually when I turned 11, because we were grappling for herring roe on kelp.
And this is where the herring literally lay their eggs on top of the kelp, which is a long time delicacy. And
exactly. And my father had a big tender boat, and so there was a couple of Japanese technicians that would then determine the quality of the kelp and the quality of the roe, and then they would determine the price that we were going to get paid. And so my first income from the sea was kelping, fishing herring, long lining for bottom fish, purse seining for salmon and herring, gill netting for herring. Then the Exxon-Valdez oil spill happened on March 24th, 1989.
Again, just a reminder, we're on Prince William Sound. This was the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history at that time.
Yes. And when that happened, Exxon hired me to go out and round up kelp and pull it aboard my boat and bring it over and put it in totes, where they would then take hot water wash and dump chemicals and soap into the totes. And my job was to clean as much as the oil off the kelp as I could, and then put it into a clean tote, and then take that back out and dump it in the sea. Because Exxon wanted everyone, especially in the media that was flying over, to see clean kelp and say, oh, the damage wasn't that bad.
But that process killed the kelp, no?
Yeah, it killed the kelp as soon as I put that hot water on it. And whatever organism that was inside of that kelp died immediately with the chemicals and the soap. Because what people still need to realize is that the number one response to oil spills is dispersants. And the dispersants, which they call Corexit, basically takes the kelp, and it's like pouring carburetor fluid on oil. And so what it does is it sinks the oil into the water column so it's out of the public view. So this is the way that the oil companies can lessen their damages that they owe and make everybody think that the oil spill was a lot less than it actually was.
And yet today, 35 years later, a lot of that oil is just subsurface now.
Any of the protected bays where the Exxon-Valdez landed on the beaches that doesn't have a lot of weather or tidal action or weather action, you can dig down 3 inches to 2 feet and there's oil. So the oil is still prevalent in different areas in Prince William Sound. There's still dead zones. And so what happened with our herring, which plummeted from 200,000 ton of Pacific herring returning to Prince William Sound annually, dropped down to as low as 4,000 ton returning. And the problem was that they were no longer reproducing. And if they weren't spawning, then there was going to be a new run of herring. And so what was happening was the herring had lacerations and lesions, meaning they were bleeding underneath their scales and had some sort of a disease from the Exxon-Valdez oil spill. And so with oil seepage still coming out of some of the beaches and going out into the water and onto some of those kelp forests that are out there near the intertidal zone, then those herring weren't reproducing. But herring are smarter than us humans. They decided to move out onto the eastern delta down near Controller Bay, down near Catella, and start spawning in cleaner waters. And now the numbers are up around 20,000 ton.
Still 10% of what they were before the spill.
Yeah.
And it's 35 years later.
Exactly. And it's not nearly enough to warrant a fishery yet, but the thing about it, I've always explained to people, and this is what I believe, is that when the herring recover, all the critters impacted by the Exxon-Valdez oil spill, there was 27 different species impacted, will all recover, as well as the humans, because it was devastating to lose that herring economy because it was 50% of our annual income. We made 50% of our money from the ocean before we caught our first salmon. And so when that fishery was stripped from us and not compensated by Exxon, we lost a huge income. And then when the prices of salmon plummeted along with permit prices and boats, it was tough to make a living here for 25 years.
And one of the things you did was create the Native Conservancy, which was the first of its kind. And tell me what inspired you and when you did that and why.
When the Exxon-Valdez oil spill trustee council was formed after we were able to wrangle $1 billion from Exxon, $900 million in an out-of-court settlement for restoration in the spill zone with an additional $100 million reopener that would pay the last $100 million based on the science from 1989 to the present. If it showed that more restoration was needed, we'd get that last $100 million, which Exxon never paid because the government never pursued it. But out of the $900 million, we felt that the best restoration that could possibly happen was to stop the clear cutting that the native corporations had engaged in along the parallel path of the Exxon-Valdez oil spill. So I sat down with my family and friends and said, we're going to end up like California, Oregon, and Washington, where the fishermen in their off-season were logging and killed both industries at the same time. Because what people don't realize is salmon are actually forest animals. They're born in the forest. They come down out of the lakes, into the rivers, go out to sea, and go on their world tour for 2 to 7 years, depending on their species. And when they come back, there has to be a temperate rainforest that keeps that water cool so they can spawn. And if it's been clear cut, the water heats up, and so the salmon spawn closer to the ocean. And when they spawn closer to the ocean, they're susceptible to monsoons and winds and weather and big tides. And if the eggs get washed out, then the mortality rises, just skyrockets. And so it's not rocket scientists to figure this out, that we have to protect the habitat and protect the home of the salmon so they have a home to come home to when it's time to do the wild thing.
And you've managed to protect 1.5 million acres with it.
A million. What happened was we were able to preserve 650,000 acres for about $420 million with the Exxon-Valdez oil spill trustee council funding. And then since then, I've protected an additional 350,000 acres and about ready to save some more land on the Delta.
This was done through the Native Conservancy?
The reason I started the Native Conservancy was because when we were doing the Exxon-Valdez oil spill trustee council deals, government and some of the environmentalists demanded fee simple title for our native lands. And we fought so hard and so long and received the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to retain some of our 380 million acres that we owned. And we only retained 44 million acres, approximately 11% of our original land base. And now we were forced to sell it for conservation purposes. And I felt it was too high of a price to pay for conservation. So I started the Native Conservancy to do two things. One, figure out how we were going to stop selling fee simple title, and then figure out how we could do cultural easements along with conservation easements that guaranteed right of access for Indian people.
So basically, Alaska Native people have done very good fish and wildlife management for thousands of years. So the idea is conservation easements that allow for everything that's traditional and historically useful for the tribes.
Yes. The conservation and the cultural easements put forth a co-management agreement on how the resources are going to be managed. And the Native peoples never took more than they needed. Once the commercial fishery was turned into a commodity during limited entry in 1973, it changed the management of the fishery because it put a value on each fish and that fishing permit, the right to fish. And so prior to limited entry across the state of Alaska, probably 90% of the fisher people were Native community members. And then after limited entry in 1973, when it turned into a commodity, over 90% of those permits are now held by non-Native people who are from California, Oregon, and Washington who mismanage their fisheries.
Right, and even before that, you had J.P. Morgan and Guggenheim coming in here and using your weirs, but not opening them up, basically taking all the fish.
Exactly. Alaska has always been a natural resource extraction state for government and industry and carpetbaggers. And so when the Alaska Syndicate, led by J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheims, came in, they owned all the shipping lanes to Alaska from California. They owned all the railroads, and they built the fish traps. And they basically wiped out all of our wild fisheries. In every region, they had to create a gravel box hatchery program to restore the wild runs. And the only reason the fish traps were put out of business was because during statehood in 1959, they realized that fish traps were not the way to manage our fisheries because it basically killed every salmon. And also, they had this American bird that they called a bald eagle. And the bald eagles didn't know the difference between a hatchery and a wild fish, so they were in the hatcheries taking their share of subsistence foods. And so the people who ran the hatcheries said they wanted to restore those runs that they had killed, so they put a bounty out on killing bald eagles. So 80 to 100,000 bald eagles were shot from the sky. But during statehood, since it was the American bird, they
stopped shooting them. So this is amazing. So now the Conservancy is established. You established it. I was just out with Robert, who's one of your hunters and guides, and collecting wild meats and you're collecting fishes that go to the elders of the community?
Yeah. One of the things that we did, besides our land back work with the Native Conservancy, is we realized that saving the land and preserving the land wasn't enough, that we had to figure out how to preserve and enhance our subsistence way of life. And so when COVID had broken out, a number of elders just weren't out on the water or on the land getting their traditional food sources because everyone was worried about being around other humans and contracting this disease and dying. So we decided to ramp up our food sovereignty and food security program to actually start harvesting some of these traditional customary foods that we have always remained strong and sane and able to harvest on our own. We realized that we had to go out and do this for our elders. And at one point, we were up to harvesting 16 different species of traditional foods and processing them, packaging them, blast freezing them in our wave energy freezer system and delivering them to all of our elders. And they loved it, and they still do.
Moose and deer and duck and goose and the famous Copper River salmon that you...
and an occasional black bear.
For sausage.
Yeah. See, I grew up on the ocean. You live that wild lifestyle. You live off the land and the sea. And I remember I'd come down in the cabin someday and we had 7 little Indians on a 36-footer along with the old man and mom and our dog Rowdy sometimes. We come down in the cabin, we go seafoods again or venison again. And little did we know that this was the best food in the world. And I remember when my father became a tenderman and he started getting all these steaks, prime rib and pork chops.
And tenders are the boats
T-bones.
That support the
they
fleet.
pick up the fish from the fishermen and haul them back to town. They would sell these different meats. And so we're like excited to try these meats. And we're like, oh my God, this is not venison. We felt that it didn't have the nutritional value that we were used to. You could tell there was a major difference in taste. And I think one of the biggest things too was they were frozen and we don't know for how long or what temperatures they were frozen at. There was a lot of variables and we're just used to eating fresh and wild game, fish and game from the sea and the land our entire lives.
Speaking of traditional foods, now you're probably best known for your kelp farms that you're developing. And how did that come about, and how did the Native Conservancy come to be part of this kelp expansion?
In 2017, only 45,000 sockeye salmon were harvested on the Copper River, which normally, if normally is a word anymore, we would harvest 1 million to 2 million sockeyes, which is a lot of red salmon annually, and 40,000 king salmon.
So a huge collapse.
Huge collapse. Only 45,000 sockeyes harvested in 2017. 2018, only 90,000 sockeyes were harvested on the Copper River. And then the following year, in 2019, the ocean heated up to 76 degrees for 3 weeks down to 20 feet below the surface, 40 feet at low water.
Geez, and just to reiterate, we're in Alaska and the water temperature is 76 degrees.
Exactly. So literally across the state, millions of krill that the salmon feed on, millions of mussels, wild kelp forests, salmon and birds perished because there was no oxygen in the water. So anytime you have that fast of a heat up of temperature, then there's no oxygen. And so what happens is no longer are those salmon going to spawn in the lakes or the rivers or tributaries that are cooler. They're going to spawn in the intertidal zone where it's cooler and hope that they don't get cooked to death. And at the same time, they're susceptible to fall monsoon storms that could wash out those eggs if there's too many that spawn in the intertidal zone. And I felt like 2019 was pivotal in that I needed to figure out how we were going to learn how to grow things from the land and the sea and do it differently and do it now. And I had been a cohort of the Future of Fish, and so there were several experts in the industry that I confided with, and I'd been watching what was happening with kelp and mariculture across the world for a while. And so we decided to do a test program and create a couple pilot programs to figure out what we could grow in Prince William Sound. So we were the first ones to grow all three species, ribbon, bull, and sugar, in 1 year, in our first year. But what we realized was that there was no infrastructure in this industry. There was no markets in place, there was no processing in place, and there was all these huge barriers to entry. So the Native Conservancy decided to focus on everything from how to do your landscape analysis to figure out what could grow where, to figuring out how to write a business plan, how to get your workman's comp, how to get your insurance, how to get a boat, how to build an array, how to source your wild seed. So we even held diver certification classes so we could train divers how to go down and get the kelp themselves. And then we started talking to different people on how best to build these different arrays, how to deploy them, how to grow the seed. We didn't know where to grow the seed. We didn't know how to get the seed.
This is a huge industry in Asia. People have been eating kelp for thousands, literally thousands of years. The U.S. kelp growing, it's got a lot of hype, but it's like 0.02% of global production. Everybody's excited about it. But I've just been to Maine, where it's very commercial. You, the Native Conservancy, have a different perspective. You say you have 3 key reasons to be growing kelp.
Native peoples, we found after we started a Kelp Now tour to figure out what the indigenous peoples thought of kelp. First, they have thousands of years of harvesting kelp and enjoying it themselves. So kelp isn't new.
Like you were saying, a herring roe on kelp is traditional.
Yeah, exactly. And so indigenous peoples, what I realized was that they wanted to get into kelp farming for 3 reasons, and mariculture for 3 reasons in this order. 1, to help heal and restore the ocean, number 1. Number 2, to grow a traditional food source that they have harvested and enjoyed for thousands of years. And thirdly, they wanted to be part of a regenerative economy that wasn't based on more natural resource extraction. And that this industry, this regenerative industry, could be based on mitigation, restoration, and preservation. And so indigenous peoples just wanted to be part of and proud of a regenerative blue-green economy that they could enjoy right off their front yards in their oceans near their villages.
What's the relationship of this growing industry of kelp for food and for alginins and other processes and wild kelp? How do they relate?
One of the things that I think people need to realize is that the wild, old-growth kelp forests are actually the mother seed that is needed to start this rapidly emerging kelp farming industry. And so there should be permanent protection of all the wild kelp forests right now. And what we need to do is when we build these kelp seed nurseries and hatcheries, they have to double as laboratories to grow climate change resilient species. We need to be thinking about this now, because if the ocean is already heating up in different places around the world, then if it gets too hot, then you're not going to be able to grow these kelp species. And what I'm concerned about, if we're going to spend millions and millions of dollars to get this new ocean farming industry off the ground, then we actually have to have a plan. We have to have a vision. We have to have a mariculture plan. And right now, I don't see one in Alaska. I don't see one in America. And I certainly don't see one for the world. And as you mentioned, there's 5 leading Asian countries that grow 97% of the kelp that's grown around the world. So 50% of the aquaculture species that is in the ocean right now around the world is kelp. And yet 97% of the kelp that is eaten in the world is eaten by those same 5 Asian countries. So there's a huge opportunity for the rest of the world to grow more kelp. And what people also need to realize is that the wild kelp forests are actually cover and habitat for about 200 to 300 juvenile species of sea critters that hide in that kelp and are safe and can grow bigger and stronger before they go out into the wild, including young salmon and herring. I just feel like there just needs to be more education and more understanding of how the ecosystems work. And as long as we keep it natural and as wild as possible, then not only can we get this industry off the ground in a good way, this ocean farming industry, not only in a good way, but in a sustainable and thriving way. So it's actually beneficial for the environment and not just for the pocketbook.
Most of the kelp harvested today is just taken from wild forests kelp and used for alginins, for emulsifiers that go into everything from cosmetics to beer. So the wild kelp's in trouble. So do you see a movement from wild harvesting to farming?
Humans have a history of repeating history by destroying habitat, whether it's on the land or in the sea. And what happens is greed and making money gets in the way of being sensible and having common sense to do things in the right way and to do things in moderation. And so I feel that in this industry, that if things don't change with wild harvesters, then indigenous peoples are going to have to call for a ban of wild harvest of the kelp forest to not only protect the habitat that those sea critters need, but to protect that mother seed that we need to get this industry off the ground. And so if this can work for indigenous peoples, it can work for everyone. And what people need to realize is that we need to set our differences aside and figure out how we can agree on the basic principles of ocean farming and have a certain set of code or ethics or a Bill of Rights or the 10 Commandments of how we are going to do this industry that makes the most sense for the environment first and the ocean that provides a way of life for us. And then thirdly, how we can actually capitalize and do this ocean farming in a sensible way and in a good way.
Dune Lankard, Eyak environmental and cultural warrior and innovator, thank you so much for joining me on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by Blue Frontier's David Helvard and Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. You can find Rising Tide at bluefront.org or on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcast. And don't forget to recommend the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast to your friends and other ocean lovers.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky. There you are. Good boy, Sparky.